Good morning, everybody.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good.
Good, good. All right. We give another minute for maybe people to come in, and then we'll jump in.
So how far have you gotten?
Not far at all. I'm actually at the synagogue, as it turns
I was
out.
gonna say that doesn't look like your car yet.
No, no. I didn't wake up. I was gonna wake up really early, and then I just
That's
didn't. And
fine.
yeah,
It's okay.
so I'm here.
All
But
right. Yeah, I thought that looked like an office. Yeah, all right.
yeah, I just wound up just
It's
coming
okay.
here anyway. So yeah,
It's okay to sleep late, especially
better
when
to,
you have a 6 hour drive ahead of you. I mean, that's
exactly. Better to be safe.
yeah, definitely.
So, all right. All right. Well, people are streaming in and happy to have everybody here. We are going to go into um so we're now going into the topic of, I guess Hanukkah is really the next thing. I mean, I know we talked about Hanukkah before, but we were in the middle of talking about Hellenism and the Greeks. Hellenism, for those who are perhaps a little more polite about it, might call it hecanism, but it actually is no, but no, I'm kidding. That it really is.
Oh God.
Yeah, it's really Hellenism.
Right. Give me loot. Yeah, right.
Yeah, give me Lut Chasadim. That
Yeah.
was a joke I told you. I told
Oh my
yesterday.
God.
Yeah.
Hey,
Um.
can I ask you a Shavuot related question?
Yeah. Sure. Sure.
It's not just strictly Shavuot. So when a holiday overlaps Shabbat, so Friday, we always light candles on Friday night. So I looked up how, like, can I light the candles? I mean, and they said, well, you need to light from an existing flame. But who has an existing flame? I mean, I don't have a gas stove anymore. So, I mean, so we didn't. What were we supposed to do?
I mean, I guess the other ideal is to like what some people do is like they'll have like a scented candle, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
can
I didn't though. That's what I figured. You have something sort of just that's burning, and then yeah, okay, fine.
yeah. Yeah,
Because
that
you can't light a Yortzeit candle either for Yitzkor if it's Shabbat, right?
you would need to,
You
light it
have to
from.
have a candle. You have to have something lit ahead of time. But who thought I didn't think of it? Next time I will think of it. Okay,
Yeah, it's
all
okay.
right,
It's
fine.
okay. And listen, I also look, I am sympathetic to those who are, concerned about safety in the home. Let's say, you're lighting Shabbat candles and then you leave the home, maybe you're invited to somebody's home for
Especially if you have
dinner.
a cat. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, so I mean, look, safety is important,
Yeah.
so there's no doubt about that. And so um I would rather you stay safe, if you think there's a real hazard, than worry about the
Okay.
flame transfer thing.
All
I
right.
That's my sense of it.
I get it. That's what I
Yeah.
figured, but I wasn't sure
Yeah.
what the conservative movement thought about that. 'Cause,
Yeah, yeah, scented candles are good. As they say in Bull Durham, they always make nice gifts. Um, okay. As you might recall, with the time in which the Hellenized Greeks, some of whom came from Syria, which I know that's confusing, but Antiochus, the figurehead bad guy of Hanukkah, is Syrian, but he has embraced Hellenistic ideas, as have like about half the Jews. This is what the Hasmoneans, the sort of the true believers, were up against. And then there is that famous moment where Mattathias, the leader of the Hasmoneans, the leader of the father of the Maccabee family, stands up and says, "Whoever is with God, follow me." They've had enough of the oppression of Antiochus. They've had enough of the um, not destruction, but the desecration of the temple, and they are ready to revolt. And so the miracle of the victory of Hanukkah is the fact that there are, we're not sure how many there are in the Maccabee army, but the most generous estimate is 12,000 men, whereas the Hellenized Greek army is approximately 40,000. So you're talking about a vastly outnumbered army, regardless of what the actual numbers are. It's not like a few hundred against 100,000 or something like that, but it's still an incredibly unlikely victory. But it's also the fact that you have, the Greeks, the professional soldiers um, who have equipment, training, and also a elephants. No joke, they have elephants.
Elephants?
They have
Oh,
elephants. And the elephants were essentially, I mean, when you think about it, I mean, like, they obviously didn't have tanks back then, but elephants were probably the closest thing they'd have to tanks. Plus, they smell a lot worse. And so, you've got, you have all those things are what the Greeks have. And so, um, these are the things that they're up against. Um, but yet there is an upset victory. Um, Now, the thing is, these battles, we tend to think that these battles take, you know, a few weeks. It was really more like 25 years. It
oh,
really took over, a long time for it to happen for I mean, because look, I mean, you talk about 40,000 Greeks, it takes a while to defeat them. So you're really talking about that amount of time. Um, However, so that's 25 years. But within 3 years, the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, they're able to reconquer Jerusalem. So it wasn't long before they actually, they actually got there and they actually were able to clean up the temple, rededicate it. Um, as I mentioned when we talked about Hanukkah, which I know was a little while ago, um, the idea that there was a miracle of the oil was something that spread due to it was an idea that spread by the rabbis because of their dislike for the Hasmonean descendants, which we will get into what that's about. Um, so the real miracle is the military victory. That's the real, remarkable thing. But even though the temple is rededicated, there are still Greek armies to defeat, and it takes a while for it to happen. And finally, in 142 BCE, um, the Greeks finally are like, okay, all right, uncle, we're done, right? And they sign a peace treaty with the youngest of the Maccabean sons. Remember, there are five Maccabee sons, and this is with Simon. Um, and so Simon is the one who's now in charge. And once again, the Jews have sovereignty over the land of Israel. So it is a significant achievement. There's no doubt. Now, but as they say in Hamilton, winning is easy, ruling is harder. If I might misquote that a little bit, but that's the basic idea. All right, great. You've won the revolution. What comes next? So what comes next is Simon now is in charge. Well, the first thing he does is he's the high priest, right? He's a Kohen because his father was a Kohen. So he's the high priest. He's the one in charge of the temple. But He also takes on the title of Nasi, which means prince or president, or in other words, he is both the political and religious leader. He does not want to call himself king because, as we've talked about at different points, the king has to come from the Davidic line, has to come as a descendant of David. So he's not calling himself that, but he is making himself both political and religious leader. Um, but what winds up happening, though, is that Simon's trying to be sort of nuanced about it, but his descendants kind of say, well, we're basically the king. Like, I mean, like his descendants were like, oh, no, no, I'm the king. And therefore they started to act in the ways that kings often act, which means I can do whatever I want. And they let the power go to their own heads. So the Hasmonean dynasty lasts a little more than 100 years. And what they start doing is a couple of things. They decide to expand the territory of the Israelite kingdom. But eventually, they have a lot of moral decline. Within a few generations, the descendants of the Maccabees, the descendants of Simon, they become Hellenized. It's like Animal Farm, right? The animals rebel against the human beings, and the pigs wind up becoming, the superior of all the animals. And then at the end of the book, people looked at the pigs and looked at the humans and couldn't tell the difference between the two of them. They had become what they had fought against. And the worst thing they did, well, I mean, there are a lot of bad things, but the worst thing they did is they began to do forced conversions. This is not a Jewish idea. This is something that I feel very strongly about. Like, we do not proselytize, but they didn't seem to worry about that. So, what then happens is that um, you had a number of, like I said, these descendants, right? You have Alexander Yanai, who is largely Hellenized, right? And then Alexander Yanai dies, and there's a brief respite because his wife, who is known as Queen Shalom Tzion, who's also known as Salom, she's in charge for about 10 years. And she's actually she tamps down the Hellenism, and she has a brother named Shimon ben Shetach, who becomes the leading rabbi of his generation. So for about 10 years, things go back to the way that the Maccabees had originally intended, the way that the Jewish people originally had intended. But that doesn't last long. Her two sons are named Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. These are great names, by the way. I mean, they're hard to say, but they're great in their own fun way. Um, and they went back to previous generations and they were like, okay, well, one of us needs to be king. And they couldn't decide who should be king. So one of them has the bright idea, let's bring in Rome to mediate. Not smart, because Rome isn't really interested in being a benevolent party in all this. Certainly not at that point. So in comes the Roman general Pompey in the year 63 BCE. And he's happy to come in. And he decides to come and bring his armies in. And as you can imagine, that was the end of Jewish self rule in the land for a while. Okay. So we'll pause for a moment, right? Because we're in the first century before the Common Era at this point. We should talk about what's happening religiously. I know I spoke before, and I certainly talked about this last week, about the idea that there is always diversity in practice throughout Jewish history. Rarely, if ever, is there basically one way that our ancestors dealt with things in terms of religious practice. There have always been splits, some more acrimonious than others. The ideal kind of split took place at the very beginning of the rabbinic era. And it was embodied by two people, one named Hillel and one named Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were part of the trend of that was starting to emerge, in which there wasn't a lot of faith in the efficacy and the morality of the Kohanim, of the priests, the ones who are supposed to be the religious leaders. There wasn't a great deal of faith in them. So what happens instead is that you have these teachers who take it upon themselves to pass on the oral Torah from generation to generation. These great teachers wind up taking on the title of rabbi, of Rav, teacher. And that's where that all starts, right? And and what happened was there would always be two rabbis who would be in charge of essentially Jewish religious practice. They always had two people. You would have a Nasi, the president, and then you would have the Av Beit Din, who is the head of the Sanhedrin being the legal body that would deal with disputes within the Jewish community. So you would always have these two people, and so they call those two people zugot, zug meaning a couple or pair, right? So you had these pairs who were in charge, and that was, certainly good to know, because having pairs in charge meant that it encouraged the Jews to eat more fruit. But beyond that, okay, yeah, I know, not the best, not the best. Okay, so but the last of the zugot, the last of these pairs are Hillel and Shammai. Okay, and Hillel eventually became the Nasi. Shammai became the Av Beit Din. And and the thing is, the house of Hillel's disciples, and Shammai's disciples kept on getting in arguments over the proper way of doing things religiously. And with only a few exceptions, our tradition tells us that the law eventually goes according to Hillel in almost every case. Now, why is that the case? Because supposedly, in the teaching houses of Shammai, they would explain their position first and then say, oh, well, other people think this, yada, yada. But Hillel, in the house of Hillel, they would explain other people's positions first and then say their position. So, according to our tradition, because Hillel shows deference, the law winds up agreeing with him more often. But Hillel and Shammai become the paragon of how to disagree peacefully and respectfully. They become the ultimate example of that. They say that the disciples of Hillel and Shammai, their families wind up marrying into one another, and so there's a great merger between these families. And even when there were different disputes, there were they were done, we are taught, with great respect and decency. Uh, and by the way, there's actually a practice that some people hold in which they go by both the suggestion of Hillel and the suggestion of Shammai, because it was taught that when you light Hanukkah candles, they had opposite ideas of how you do it. The Shammai way was to light 8 candles the first night, 7 candles the second night, 6 candles the third night, from there. Hillel's tradition, 1 candle the first night, 2 candles the second night, etc. Now, my guess is that most, if not all of you, do things the Hillel way. Okay. That is what the standard Jewish law tells us. But there are some people who have begun to make a point of lighting 2 Chanukiot every night. One Chanukiah they light the Hillel way, and one Chanukiah they light the Shammai way, as an expression to make sure that we remember that there's more than one way of doing things, and that when we argue with respect, we're all the better for it. There are numerous stories told about Hillel and Shammai. Some of those stories make Shammai not seem like the nicest person, which is unfortunate because Shammai is actually a decent person. He just had a shorter temper than Hillel. But we're told that no one was ever as patient as Hillel. There are stories about Hillel about how um, uh, like students would have contests with each other. They would have contests with each other, each one daring the other to make Hillel lose his patience. I bet I can make him lose his patience. I bet I can make him, so they would do things like, it would be Friday afternoon, and they would interrupt him as he was getting ready for Shabbat and say, Rav Hillel, and they would ask like the most absurd, ridiculous questions, um, at which most people would say, okay, can I, getting ready for Shabbat. Can we talk about this later, for crying out loud? But Hillel was always very calm and answered the question no matter what, right? The most famous story, of course, told about Hillel and Shammai is that this prankster, or kind of wise guy, depending on how you want to put it, um, goes to Shammai and say, "Hey, Shammai, can you teach me the whole Torah while I'm standing on one foot?" And Shammai says, "Get out of here. That's ridiculous." And Hillel says, and then he goes to Hillel, says the same thing, and Hillel says, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That's the whole Torah. Now go study." Hillel is praised for that generous and patient answer. And yet, and it is quite remarkable that he does that, and it's a cherished story. I would submit to you, though, that honestly, most of us would react like Shammai. I mean, let's be honest. Like if somebody came up to us and said, if they wake us up from sleep and say, "Hey, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?" You would be like, "You woke me up for this." So it's not that Shammai's a bad guy; it's that Hillel is just an incredibly saintly person. That's sort of the point that they're trying to make. Shammai is considered a good person too. So it's because of Hillel and Shammai's greatness that the rabbinic tradition is solidified. It's still relatively underground. It's still not widely followed, but the seeds that they plant wind up bearing a great deal of fruit at a time later that the Jews will really need it. Okay. I've talked a bit. Questions, comments?
I have one. It may be a little bit off topic. Um, I started thinking about it, and then something else happened. When I was cleaning at my mom's house earlier this week, I opened up a box, and there's like 6 or 7 mezuzahs. So my question is, when do I take the mezuzah down at my mother's house? And then what do I do with all of them?
So, excellent question. All right. So her home. So, is her home still in your possession?
Yes.
Okay. And without trying to get into like your personal business, like, are you planning on selling it at some
Yes, we're
point?
working on getting it to ready to go on the market.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay. So, um, the tradition is that you keep the mezuzot up until a buyer is identified.
Okay.
And if the buyer is happens to be Jewish, you just leave them up for them to have.
Okay.
If the buyer is not Jewish, then you take them down. And with that, and as far as what you do with them, when if that is the case, what do you do with them? There are many people who would certainly appreciate having extra mezuzot due to
Okay.
the I mean, look, if you wish to keep them, that's certainly your prerogative, but um I'm sure we'd be happy to take them and pass them along to somebody if it comes to that.
Okay. I was just curious as to when it comes down. Is there any special services or words you use when you take it down?
Good question. I don't know of one. I mean, and
Okay.
I suppose somebody may have come up with something, but I'm not aware. But I yeah, I mean, yeah, it's an interesting thing. I was the house I lived in Buffalo. It was a house I owned, and it wound up selling to a Jewish family. So I remember, and I had mezuzot on the bedrooms that my kids used when they would be up there, and I said, "Oh, I guess I need to get." When I went to Israel in 2023, in the spring of 2023, I said, "Oh, I guess I need to get new mezuzot for my kids." And somebody suggested, actually, you know what? Why don't you keep the mezuzot that your kids have, and then get new mezuzot for the buyers? So I switched them, but they had mezuzot there that they could then utilize for themselves. And if they wanted to change them afterwards, that was certainly fine. But I wanted to make it so that but I was able to switch the cases so that my kids still had the cases that they liked. So, um, yeah. So excellent question. Okay, so. So that was Hillel and Shammai. Now let's roam over to the Romans. Um, uh, at this point, the Roman Republic has transformed into, pretty much a full-blown empire, right? And, um, uh, Pompey brings his armies into Israel, and it's bad news from the start. And says, okay, um, let's go in, let's kill some Jews along the way. And then Hyrcanus, who was one of these two children of this queen, he was considered the weaker of the two brothers. So the Romans said, well, let's put him in charge. I think he should be in charge, and essentially made him sort of the Roman puppet. So yeah, he was in charge, but the Roman Empire was really in charge. Um, so Hyrcanus, is basically powerless. That's a good way to remember it. Hyrcanus is powerless, and the Sanhedrin, which had real power in the community, was basically was abolished. A few years into the Romans taking over, and they first of all only let Hyrcanus basically have any authority in Jerusalem and then a few places sort of surrounding that. But he couldn't do anything without checking in with the Roman Empire. And so the real Roman ruler was a guy named Antipater. And Antipater is not that significant in the end, but his son is. His name is Herod. Now, Herod, who did not go by the nickname of Harry, Herod is called Herod the Great. He is only called Herod the Great because one thing he does that is the thing he does that is great is that he is a remarkable builder. In terms of personality, he is anything but. He is a despot of the highest order. He is, we throw around this word sometimes, and without necessarily thinking about it. Herod is literally insane. Like I mean, I'm not trying to be histrionic about it. He is unwell. Um, and so he he winds up building quite a few things that and part of his idea is to add to the greatness of the Roman Empire, and to bring some of that glamour into Israel. And so he winds up building a lot of Roman style buildings throughout Israel. Some beautiful ones you can see is if you've ever been to the coastal town of Caesarea. I mean, don't get me wrong, beautiful, beautiful buildings. Um, but he also looked at the Second Temple and said, "Oh, this is cute, but we can really gussy it up." And so much of what became of the Second Temple, it became bigger and brighter and more glamorous than the one of Solomon. But that was mostly because Herod added all these sort of Roman flourishes to it. One thing he added were retaining walls. And that's important because we know of a retaining wall that's still important to us, and that's the one that still stands and is known as the Kotel. So it is kind of, maybe one could see it as kind of an irony of history that the very place that we look at as uh, a holy spot was actually built by Herod and his people. Um, Herod essentially makes sure that the Jews are taxed greatly. He doesn't stand in the way of Jews practicing their religion, but they said, okay, if you do that, we're taxing you. Um, Now, Herod did make the temple remarkable, but what he also did was he put in the main entrance a gigantic Roman eagle, which was not, and I mean, and so there were these uh, students of Torah who said this is idolatry. We have to, take this down. They decide to sneak over. They knock it down. Herod finds out and has them executed. So we knew who really was in charge. In terms of his, insanity, right? He killed members of his own family on the regular. Um, Herod also decided he could control who was the high priest, who was the Kohen Gadol. And so he had a, so he had a son named Aristobulus, who was 17 years old. He's like, okay, hey, Aristobulus or Eris or whatever they called him, right? You're going to be you'll be the high priest. He was 17. Now the Jews actually liked him. The Jews actually kind of said, hey, this guy's all right. And Herod saw how popular he was and had him drowned. He had a couple of his wives murdered. I'm going to read from this from Josephus. His passion also made him stark mad, and leaping out of his bed, he ran around the palace in a wild manner. His sister Salome took the opportunity also to slander his wife Miriam and to confirm his suspicions about Joseph, Miriam's alleged lover. Then, out of his ungovernable jealousy and rage, he commanded both of them to be killed immediately. But as soon as his passion was over, he repented of what he had done, and as soon as his anger was worn off, his affections were kindled again. Indeed, the flame of his desires for her was so hard that he could not think she was dead, but he would appear under his disorders to speak to her as if she were still alive. He wasn't well. And I'll leave it at this. It's not great when the person in charge is not well. So um, Herod the Great is in charge for a while, and things continue to go bad to worse under this time. Now, I want to mention about the importance of Josephus. I talked to him. I talked about him. I talked to him. No, Herod would have talked to him. I talked about him on the first day of Shavuot. Josephus was one of the one of the first great historians, probably the first great historian uh, of Judaism, of the Jewish people. He was uh, not he was he was prone to hyperbole here and there. There's no doubt, but he was not a but he knew that it was important to write things down, and he wound up writing a um, he wound up writing quite a few works that have survived to this day. It had its own bias. He was writing, however, under the thumb of the Roman Empire, so how much you can trust his subjectivity is a question, but still, thank goodness we have. Now, he lived a little bit a bit after some of the things that he described, but he, um, when he eventually, the things that he eventually wrote about coincided with the destruction of the Second Temple. So this is what we want to talk about at this point. Um, at this point, the Romans are tired of the Jews who follow Torah, and they were just like, let's just nip this in the bud right now. Um, and the Romans at this point start to suppress not only the Jewish community, but also Jewish practice. Um, there is a city known as Gamla, where in 67 of the Common Era, um, Gamla actually still stands, and it's actually one of the best preserved Roman battle sites. In 67 CE, the Romans annihilated the Jews of Gamla, killing about 4,000 of them. Um, there were 5,000 that still remained, and they eventually um, ran to the hills and then jumped off of the hills, right? And so Gamla is kind of like the story of Masada, right? Gamla is kind of the Masada of the North. So Masada being another example of the Jews who decided, rather than being under Roman oppression, to take their own lives. In the summer of 70 CE, the Romans had basically knocked out all of the parts of Israel that had been resisting them, and now they went up to Jerusalem. There were between 100 and 150,000 people who lived in Jerusalem at that point. But other Jews were coming into Jerusalem after the Romans had killed their cities. They fled to Jerusalem. So there were a bunch of Jews there at that point. Um, it took a little while for the Romans to siege Jerusalem because of the all the walls, right? Because of the fortifications that were there. Um, so it actually looked kind of like it was going to be hard for the Romans to do that. And they tell the story of Sinat Chinam. What is Sinat Chinam? It is a Sinat Chinam means essentially needless hatred. Now, not like we need hatred. I'm not trying to make that distinction, but Sinat Chinam refers to um, hatred that goes beyond uh, typical dislike, right? We don't have to like everybody in our, that we ever meet, obviously, but to do gratuitously cruel things, we are taught that Jews were engaging in cruel things. We talked about this when we talked about Tisha B'Av. And so the Jews of Jerusalem, they were fortified and there was good water supply. Like they could have held out for a while. But according to our rabbinic sources, they did not, they were not able to withstand Roman pressure because they could not get their own act together because of senseless hatred. And the Romans wound up chipping away, and chipping away until Jerusalem was conquered and the Second Temple was destroyed.
Senseless hatred for whom? Who were they hating?
Jews hating other Jews.
That's what I figured. Okay, just checking. All right.
Yeah. We've talked about, or at least last week I mentioned about the idea of a paradigm shift. The destruction of the Second Temple is one of only a handful of paradigm shifts in Jewish history. The first temple, as we know, was rebuilt. The Second Temple has not been rebuilt. It was one thing for the Babylonians to destroy the first temple. The Roman Empire was too powerful for there to be any kind of quick turnaround and building of a third temple. People held out hope, but it wasn't to be. And so a very important figure in all this is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He was the leader of the Pharisees. He sees the writing on the wall. Jerusalem is going to fail. The story goes that there was a point where the Romans would basically kill anybody trying to leave the city. So Yochanan ben Zakkai has this great idea. He put himself in a casket and had people carry him out so that he would escape. Yochanan ben Zakkai was lucky enough to be friendly with the Roman authorities, including the Emperor Vespasian, if I'm saying that right. Vespasian? Not sure. So he goes to the emperor and says, okay, the jig is up, you've won. And Vespasian says, okay, thank you for the acknowledgement. Is there anything you wish? And he says, Yochanan ben Zakkai says, give me the city of Yavne and its sages. Meaning, give me a city, give me a town where I can go and be safe, and I can have other scholars with me. This was perhaps the moment that, I mean, there were a lot of moments, but this was like maybe the emblematic moment of how Judaism was saved. Because Yochanan ben Zakkai understood, okay, if we're not going to have a temple, what we do still have is the Torah. Its laws, its traditions, and the oral law as well. Let me set up a place where people can learn about it and still observe Jewish life. So a yeshiva was set up in Yavne, in Israel. But remember, it's not that all the Jews were living in Israel. Remember, there was still a bunch in Babylonia who had never come to Israel in the first place. And they had begun to set up places of learning. And so these two main locations, Babylonia and Yavne, became the heart of the transformation of Judaism from a temple-based religion to eventually a synagogue-based religion.
Where is Yavne?
Yavne is a little bit, I was worried you were going to ask me that. I think a little bit south of Jerusalem.
You just don't
Yeah.
have your phone near me. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. um, so this is how Judaism is able to be saved. Now, there is one great last gasp, however, of the Roman Jewish community. And this happens a number of decades after the fall of the temple. And the person who was emblematic of it was a man named Simon Bar Kosiba, who wound up being given a different name. One of the great rabbis of the first couple centuries of the Common Era was named Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva has this legendary story of being somebody who really knew nothing about Judaism, didn't even know the Aleph Bet until he was 40, and then embraces Judaism, learns, and becomes not only a rabbi, but the great rabbi of his generation. Around the same time as Rabbi Akiva is rising to prominence, there is a Jewish revolt in and around Jerusalem led by this man, Simon Bar Kosiba. He is a great warrior. He organizes a large guerrilla army. And in 132 of the Common Era, he gets the Romans out of Jerusalem. For a couple of brief years, Simon Bar Kosiba leads a small Jewish state in Jerusalem. Rabbi Akiva aligns himself with Bar Kosiba and says, no. He is now Shimon Bar Kokhba, meaning son of a star. Why is this significant? Because one of the things that some people believed about the Messiah, about a Jewish Messiah, was the idea that his arrival would be presaged by a falling star. So, in other words, Rabbi Akiva is saying, you've been looking for your Messiah? Looks like we got him. There are a couple of brief years of respite, but the Romans came back to crush Bar Kokhba. And famously, Rabbi Akiva himself is martyred as a result of this. So we have this little epilogue to ancient Jewish life in the land of Israel. The Bar Kokhba revolt and then the Roman response is pretty much the end of it. So this is a difficult time, obviously, in Jewish history, but because of the because of the seeds planted by people like Hillel and Shammai and by Yochanan ben Zakkai and by other rabbis, Judaism is still going and it's transforming. And we now have an ability to endure in spite of all this. I think that's where I should leave off for today. So I think what I'll talk about next time is I'll get into the rise of Christianity in terms of prominence, and then get into some Middle Ages, the beginning of the Middle Ages at the very least, and how the rabbinic era, is coincides with all that. Questions, comments?
So this sort of relates. I mean, we saw a really fascinating thing on YouTube yesterday about how someone did a large study of the DNA of Jews from all over the world, Mizrahi Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, Ethiopian Jews, Bukharian Jews from everywhere. And we have a very large amount of common DNA going back to the Levant. And they attribute that. Why this makes me cry, I have no idea. I'm such a sap. I cry over everything. Is Torah and the continuity of Torah and the language. And apparently, especially the Mizrahi Jews had a very low rate of intermarriage. But I thought that was absolutely fascinating. After all these years, we still have a very large amount of common DNA. I mean, who would have thought,
Yeah. No, I forget whether I said this last week. There's a statement that the winners write history.
Yeah.
I like to amend that by saying the winners write history, and so do the Jews. Now, I'm not trying to call Jews losers.
No,
but like, in other words, what other nation? I mean, look, plenty of civilizations younger than Jewish civilization
come and gone, and we're still here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's in no small part to the fact that we acknowledge the bad stuff. We acknowledge the bad stuff and we find ways to keep going. The resilience, it goes, it should go without saying, is, I think, very much tied to our embrace of history. All right. So hopefully that is a brighter thought in spite of everything else. Yes, Mark.
Is it the case that really Masada was sort of a rumor that was vaguely mentioned in Josephus and then was excavated and discovered and turned out to be true?
I don't know the sequencing of that. I'm not sure. Like what came first, sort of the rumor or the the story or the excavation. That I'm not sure about.
I thought there was a vague reference somewhere in Josephus about these guys that had gone off. I really don't know what it said, but then when they found it, it was like, oh. So this is
could very well be. Could very well be. Yeah, I offhand I'm not remembering regarding that, but good question. But hopefully a more hopeful note that we are ending on. So we will see everybody soon.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Oh, all right.
Wow.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Safe travels.